AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to the show. I'm your host Mike Froggatt and we're joined today by Dilara Ally, who is Head of Computational Biology and Data Science at Joyn Bio. Lara, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you for being here. I wanted to start off with that short introduction, but why don't you tell me a little bit more about Joyn Bio and what you guys are doing at the moment?
Sure. Joyn Bio is a joint venture between Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a synthetic biology company, and Bayer Crop Science, which is one of the leaders in agricultural products. And the venture is a 50-50 joint venture, and it was started in October 2017 as a way to bring innovation to Bayer Crop Science. And so we're an independent company, and the idea here is to use synthetic biology or the concept of synthetic biology and metabolic engineering and be able to upskill microbes. And so right now, one of the flagship projects that Joyn has is a way to fix nitrogen and transfer it to the plant so you can dramatically reduce synthetic fertilizer. And this is by upskilling or finding a microbe that can be used as a seed treatment.
Thank you for that. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about your general day-to-day?
Sure. So the day-to-day runs quite the gamut. I'm mostly in meetings with different stakeholders. And so an example is I'll often be in a meeting with a business leader to try and get from them an understanding of what our strategic partnerships will look like, what will our key needs be in the future, what are the technologies that they are thinking of driving forward. And by technologies, I mean here biotech technologies, not necessarily data science technologies. And then what are the goals and priorities of that in terms of a timetable? And then that becomes kind of the framework that I operate within, is to then, use what they've told me to translate into a data architecture or, the scientific strategy that my organization might be based on. The other part of my job is really doing communication. So talking to scientists who are in the labs to help them make sure they understand the value that a computational organization can bring in two ways. One, the first way is really if we're trying to build a data architecture that will enable them to do their work, then they need to understand what is a data architecture. How do you go from a data model into something that will help them do their day-to-day work, whether it's a database or, if it's an application interface. I need them to be helping me to, to build that those components. And so the translation and the communication is a really big part of getting them to understand how can they participate in that, because they're really the drivers of what we build. We're really just helping and enabling them. So it's not just about the data architecture. It's also about, what is the value of bringing a data scientist into assay development and validation, and how can a data scientist, whether it be an actual statistician, a biostatistician, or a data scientist who's going to be integrating that information, how do they help answer the scientific questions that these subject matter experts have? So really getting them to see the translation. And then I'm, also actually getting down and dirty in some of the science. I'll be in a meeting with a scientist or a group of scientists to discuss results. And so, talking about models, how do you validate? So, I spend some of my time doing that. And then a really big component of my job and my day-to-day is working with my team and creating the teams, resourcing the teams, defining the strategy for the teams. We have sort of four foci of our computational group. And the first one is really, how are all the systems that we want to build, how do they all fit together? Sort of from a genomic, if you think about the computational biology, it's really about the genomic architecture. So we're really asking, if you have a system that you're, trying to build, just as you would with data architecture, what are all the pieces? How do they operate together? If you perturb it, what happens to it? And so that's kind of the focus of the computational biology teams. And then the second one is the statistical inference and experimental design. And this is, again, where I mentioned, really supporting those wet lab scientists to get us the high veracity data that we really need to do a lot of the data science work that we want to be able to do. And then the third group is thinking about the types of questions that make sense for the data scientists to do. How might we do that? What are the systems that we would need to put in place to ensure that we can answer those questions? And then the last one is really about the systems. What is the data architecture that we would need to support our organization's business goals?
Okay. So it sounds like overall there's a lot going on, but it sounds like your main role now is making sure the team structure's there, but also taking the business message and sending it to your team in order for them to actually deliver. So how is the team then using computational biology and data science to answer those questions?
In the case of our computational biologists, they're embedded in the project team. So Joyn Bio is structured as a matrix organization, which means we have projects and then we have our functional departments. And each project gets resourced a functional scientist. So from the computational biology and data science team, we are specifically resourcing to the projects a computational biologist. And that computational biologist is going to be thinking about, how do I support my microbial engineers or my plant scientists or the fermentation and formulation folks in terms of moving those project goals forward. And I would say kind of more sort of generically, we're creating, we're engineering microbes, and the goal when you're engineering a microbe is to make sure that the system, when it's perturbed, does what you hope it would do. And so really then the computational biologists are trying to make sure that they can, support the strategies of the project teams. Can they, integrate information from different, sources? How do they help move things through the pipeline? So that's really a piece of what they do. And what we have created is a platform group, and that platform group consists of a team of data scientists and biostatisticians, and then a team of people who build our data infrastructure. And so the other way that we're trying to address these questions, what are the sort of science that we're actually doing, is things like experimental design or statistical inference, and then helping to create some of that, in order to do your machine learning, in order to do the really strong prediction, you need really good data. And you need to be collecting, the data quality is really important, and that accuracy and that consistency, all of that plays into, are you collecting the right data? So this is a big part of what this team will be doing is doing right now, is making sure we're getting the right type of data to answer the questions for data science. And so can you ensure through experimental design that you have the right pieces in place? And then, as I mentioned, there's a team that's actually then thinking about integrating that information right across all functional teams, all across the sort of pipeline, to really do this prescriptive and predictive approach to say, are you learning the right things? Because there's this whole, in synthetic biology, it operates off of this design, build, test, and learn. And this learning is really where I see the data scientists being able to help, move us in a direction that makes sense to make sure that we're actually learning from our failures. And that's a really, really a big challenge, I think. And then our data architecture is really about, are we putting the right pieces in place to ensure that we can enable that learning?
Right. Okay. Well, speaking about learning, then I know you started your career in academia. What got you into computational biology and data science to start with?
So I would say that so my PhD was in had three main components. I was in the field, I was in the lab, and I was really focused on data. And I was terrible in the lab. I nearly burnt our lab down. We got a new autoclave, and I put something in it, and it exploded and created this mess. And so I think it was really good that for the safety of the people around me that I went the direction of data. You know, and then to be honest, I just found the conceptual, the statistical, the thinking about how do you solve this from an algorithmic point of view, or with data, what data would you need, that piece really interesting. And I really, counting pollen grains or pipetting this, into a 96 well plate was just like boring for me. And so I couldn't, I didn't really find that attractive. I just wanted to spend time with the data. I wanted to ask really interesting questions. I wanted to try different things. And so I started heading in that direction. And then specifically why I ended up in industry is probably because I had this, what I would call an existential crisis on the day before my exit seminar, where I was thinking about, my research, and I was wondering, what is the really reason, what could I do with this from an applied point of view, and how would I contribute? Would there be an impact? And I asked my supervisor, hey, do you ever question what you're doing is worth it? And she, without hesitation said no. And so then I started to think, well, maybe this, basic science is not for me. It sounds like she, and I really support, basic science, but for me, I needed something more. I needed to give back. I needed to influence, or I needed to have an impact, with the work that I was doing. So I think that is what drove me then to be looking very early on in, when I started to kind of move into a postdoc, was where could I have an impact? And I started to think about, the plants and the interaction between plants and the microbes, and especially like I was working with bacteriophage. This is a virus that infects bacteria, thinking about how could you use these systems to protect plants, and then ended up in a small startup in San Diego that was really focused on, egg, and just ended up, being embedded in the egg sector for a number of years, and just really feeling like this is the space that I can contribute and just really make a difference.
Interesting. Okay. So going forward then, what excites you about the future of data within agriculture specifically?
So many things that are exciting. Right now, I think ag is really far behind pharma in being able to utilize AI and using farm data to help farmers analyze in real time all kinds of things like weather, temperature, water, soil, to better make better decisions. And so I think that's a really big space right now for AI. I think what is another really interesting space when you think about it is, how do you, improve, how do you do precision ag? That's a really key place where I would say there's kind of an overlap between what Joyn Bio is doing and this idea of precision ag. And that's because, if you're trying to identify when a plant is going to be diseased, or when it's going to, when is it likely to experience high pest pressure, or, what's its nutrient status. This is a place where you then think, oh, well, if, you have these microbes that are optimizing the plant's capability of utilizing nutrients, and you have these, tools, they really are, there's a real synergy there. And then I think that there's actually a big space for AI in the R&D, like in the discovery phase. And even before you begin to, go to the farm, thinking about, how you might understand the plant microbe system and how you might predict those. And it's really difficult, right? So it's a really complex system. It's context dependent. It's affected by all the things that I mentioned, like soil conditions, water, temperature, all of those things, the health state of the plant, understanding the sort of microbial interactions and then being able to predict that. And I think that to me that's where I get really juiced.
That's where the fun stuff happens.
Yeah, I really think that's where the fun stuff happens.
Okay, Dilara, you mentioned the future of data modeling being quite exciting. Is there any specific things that you're really looking forward to?
Data modeling and AI in ag is that, I read somewhere that by 2025, the AI market for ag would be valued at $2.6 billion. And so what that means is that, right now, what we're seeing with these types of machine learning algorithms is the primary use is in crop management processes. And it's really at every stage of growing and harvesting a crop, from which seed to plant in which soils, the soil management, figuring out what nutrients that, for example, might use water and nutrients more efficiently, yield prediction, crop quality. And in and among those, for me, one of the places where I think is pretty cool is disease detection. And this is part of the general sort of precision ag management of chemistries. And this is really interesting because it will allow farmers to really target their chemical inputs in terms of time, place, and space. The thing about these, data modeling processes they're all machine learning based, and they're really focused on learning associations between the variables, and they require an enormous amount of data. And I think this is really great when you're trying to do something like diagnosis in the case of disease, or you're forecasting, yield, for example, or crop management practices. Mm-hmm. I think the part where I get really excited is when I think about the combination of causal inference and machine learning in discovering new technologies for improving crop productivity. And I'm thinking more specifically about, the plant microbe relationship that we're investigating in our, the work that we're doing at Joyn. And here we're really interested in understanding and knowing how the presence of that microbe influences the productivity or the health of the plant. And yes, you can do experiments in greenhouse and trials and field trials, and you can try to, using these very specialized experiments, infer, the relationships. And there are still many limitations associated with these experimental systems, and you can't control and change all the factors or create an intervention. So what you need to do is think differently. You need to kind of understand what would the reality be of that system if circumstances, environments were different. And I think this is where, in the case of partnering causal inference and machine learning, we might be able to, not just predict outcomes, but proactively think about what are the microbes we'd want to choose given our understanding of how it might impact productivity or plant health.
Interesting. So do you think there's any, or is there any research being done into people's eating patterns and habits changing potentially to show what you need to be farming more of and what needs to be focused more on as far as developing new crops?
I know that when I was at Bayer, they have a quite a big what they call test kitchen, and they look at people's preferences for different crops like tomatoes or melons, or and how they would use that as a particular indication or a trait of what they then would want to develop. they do have quite a lot of analytics around that to try and for especially vegetables and fruits.
No, that's super interesting. I mean, you're going to have to see what people's habits do change to, but the big thing that we know is definitely going to be true is more. And the production, we're only having more people in the world, and we're only consuming more food on average. So what can we do in order to produce more food using less space and less resources?
That's right. And
I
think these technologies are going to help. We're still a long way away. I think there's a lot of promise, and it's not quite yet materialized in a way that I think has the potential. And I think that these, in probably the next 5 to 10 years, as we see improvements in some of these IoT technologies, we'll start to see really disruptive aspects to crop management practices and how farmers are going to be managing their farms, maybe all completely by their cell phones, which
right.
is so cool, right? I mean,
absolutely. The new generation of farmers already on their phone. We're doing different types of app work anyway. May as well be to manage their.
And I think that would be, really cool if you imagined you could also do that in the lab, right? If you had the ability to do all of your experimentation via your cell phone or your computer, it's the same thing. I think that's the direction that, Ginkgo Bioworks is going, is they're trying to think about biology, like you would software systems. And so that's what makes Joyn unique, is that we have this, our value proposition is we have access to the Ginkgo Foundry that, they're thinking in this direction. So it enables us to do, the types of things that we want to do, which is maybe looking at a slightly different focus rather than worrying so much about the early part of the engineering part or the optimization part. We can start looking at the impact on in plant or in a situation that we have the expertise to investigate.
Okay, so going into sustainability then, I know that's one of the things that you guys are focused on as well. So how big of a challenge is sustainability in the future of agriculture?
I think it's really interesting that we, when I worked at Bayer, this was the really interesting thing for me, was like being embedded in an organization like Bayer. I think I became more appreciative of environmental stewardship. And, Bayer spent a lot of its money, and I'm sure it still does, making sure that what was coming out of the company was not causing, I would say, environmental degradation. And that was a really big, not affecting beneficials, or you spend a lot of money, doing tox studies, making sure that environmentally and human health are protected. And so, there's that element of sustainability, right? Like there's the sort of stewardship of an ag biotech company that's really important. And I think Joyn Bio takes that very, very seriously. I think the other part of that sustainability is really thinking about food security. And I think that right now in this current crisis where, we're seeing these really crazy stories about farmers, throwing harvest, like just throwing food out, and there's milk being dumped, or there are hogs that are being slaughtered, and there's just it's not that we've not had this kind of waste before, but it's just the amount of it that is drawing our attention, and I think we're at risk, right? We already know that there are about 135 million people around the world that face extreme hunger, and I think at this point in our, when the world is kind of topsy-turvy, thinking about food and the sustainability of how much food are we going to have to produce in order to, ensure that we get to, ensure that we can actually help people not only have food, but have nutritious food, because I think that's the other piece of it that's big. So I think about, it in that element. And then I think just in terms of the adequate how do we make sure we ensure that our global food supplies are adequate? And so those are sort of the two elements of sustainability that's come to mind right now.
No, it's massively important. I mean, if you think about, we're in the middle of COVID-19 now, and COVID-19 has a maybe 2% mortality rate, but a lack of food has a 100% mortality rate, right?
Yeah.
So no, it's very important to do. But moving into kind of the next generation, so for a data scientist or a computational biologist kind of coming through the ranks, kind of starting their craft, what would you give as some advice on how to pick the right career path for them?
I think that you have to make sure that what you're doing has meaning for you, because that's what will get you up in the morning. And I think that, making sure there's sort of two elements I think a data scientist needs to have. You need to have a specialty, right? Like, I think, you're not going to be able to learn everything. You're not going to know all of the techniques. And so that's okay, because if you can learn, then you can pick up those techniques as you need to. So I think that's a really big piece of it, is just get really good at something specifically, because then that will demonstrate that you can learn, and that you can learn something, that is difficult. I think the second thing is communication. The soft skills of a data scientist, at least in the world that I operate, are key. And that's because your interface is always with a subject matter expert, like a wet lab scientist, or, we deal with fermentation and formulation scientists, we deal with plant scientists, and these folks have very different vocabularies than a data scientist might have. Right. And so you have to be able to communicate and understand. And that means, I think the number one thing is, how do you listen? And that is like, I found that to be a growth opportunity for myself, is learning how to listen. And I think what happens is you get trained as a scientist, and you're trained to speak. You're trained to give your opinion and do very little listening. And it's very difficult, right? It's if you can ask the right questions, if you can listen with, an open mind, then you get way more out of someone than if you're just trying to give your opinion. And so I think that's a big component of a data scientist. And then really knowing what is it that provides meaning in your life. Because, in a situation like we're in COVID-19, my team we're spread across the country. We have people in California, and we have people in Boston, and we have people, in other parts of the country. And I am working very hard to make sure that we're staying connected. But some of that is internal, that they would get up in the morning, that they would go to their computer, and that they would do the work in this environment, is because they're committed, and they're seeing the impact of their work, and it brings meaning to them. So that's a really big, I think, piece.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Dilara, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on the show. And I look forward to staying in touch and speaking to you again.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. For more information, contact mark@alldus.com. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.